But in order to be whole, we have to see both sides of this, the other side, like what is outside and what is inside. And that's what's missing right now in conversation. Because we have, obviously, if you want to know what's going on outside, just go to CNN or, whomever. And if you
Yeah.
want to know what's going on inside, let's go on retreat and just meditate with mala beads or do your yoga. But who is bridging the gap? Who is bringing both together? Because you need both. You cannot be, I would say, completely actualized until you can bring your inner self, the intuitive spirit, to apprehend what is happening outside of you. And you must also be aware of the beauty, the power of the objective cognitive mind that you've been given in order to clear up your own biases so you can access your intuition. This is a very, very spiritual practice. And that's why this conversation is so important.
Welcome, everyone, to the Spiritual Forum. I'm so glad you're here. Just a couple things I want to remind you of. My Whole Planet Spirituality Retreat at Unity Village, October 17th through 20th this year. You can find out more all about that at thespiritualforum.org/retreat. And also, if you want to donate to this podcast, if you benefit from it, if you want to give any way, you can do that at thespiritualforum.org. And I appreciate any ratings or reviews on Apple Podcasts, and join my YouTube channel. That's enough for my run-up. Let me introduce you to my guest today. I'm very, very thrilled to have him. Dr. Madhava Setty has an electrical engineering degree from MIT and a medical degree from Baylor College of Medicine. As a practicing anesthesiologist since 2002, Dr. Setty has closely observed thousands of patients under anesthesiology, which led him to ask fundamental questions such as, what does it mean to be awake? And does awareness require a functioning body, or does it arise out of its own? Dr. Setty is the author of the recently published book, Woke, An Anesthesiologist's View, which I've read. This book is an exploration into the idea of certainty and sharpening one's insight and intuition. Welcome, Dr. Setty.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Reverend. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
Well, you can call me Carol.
You can call me Madhava.
All
Thank
right,
you, Carol.
we've got that all figured out now. So I really shared a very, very small segment of your biography and your really interesting life. And so I thought we would start by you telling us a little bit more about you, your story, your spiritual story, and how you've come to be asking these really interesting esoteric questions and writing this fantastic book called Woke.
Well, I'm going to take the floor for a few minutes then, if you want me to go all the way. So, you hit the nitty gritty of the bio. My parents are from India. I was born in this country in the mid 60s. And as you mentioned, I have a technical background in electrical engineering. And after I finished my undergraduate studies, I went into the industry. I had a few offers to work for patent law firms or work in the Wall Street financial area as a mathematician, but I chose to stick with my industry of engineering. And for 6 years, I worked in the defense industry, essentially designing tactical simulation programs for the Army, for our Army as well as the German Army. And my last project, interestingly, was funded by the Office of Naval Research. And this was a very interesting opportunity for me as a young engineer, 25 years old. It had to do with being able to track submarines under the ice cap. And to test our approach, we actually ended up going to the ice pack north of Greenland for about 6 weeks in 1992. And it was a heady adventure for me, remarkable experience. And at the end of the entire experiment, something really interesting happened to me, which was I realized that we were sitting in one of the most pristine environments on the planet. Everywhere you looked, there was nothing but crystal clear ice flows. And it's just too expensive to bring all of our garbage and stuff we don't need back to the States. So we did what is the most cheapest and practical thing, which was to scuttle a lot of our stuff and burn the rest. And I can still see in my mind the pyre of burning garbage and smoke that we were putting into the atmosphere. And it struck me at that moment a question: what am I doing here? And what are we doing here? It turns out that 2 weeks later, after coming back to the States, I decided I was going to switch careers. And I wanted to do something that was more helpful, honestly. And it also introduced a question to my mind, which is, why are all these super intelligent people doing this when we could be helping people? Why are we trying to track submarines? Why are we even interested in warfare to begin with? And are those guys that we're trying to protect ourselves from really much different than us? So I ended up going to medical school, and I entered, as you said, Baylor College of Medicine in 1994. And I was, the odd student out. I was older than most of my colleagues, and I came from a background that was much different. Most of them were pre-med biology and chemistry majors, but I had this, degree in electrical engineering and computer science, and I had worked in a highly technical field for a long time. And so our abilities as medical students were very different. And I struggled immensely trying to memorize things and trying to make sense of things that couldn't be made sense of. So after 5 years or 4 years of medical school and 6 months of my internship in internal medicine, I had another reckoning, and I said, I can't do this anymore because we really don't know what we're doing. I mean, we have a lot of amazing things that we can do, but we have a little bit too much hubris because if you think about it, we can't explain why some people get side effects from some medications and other medications work for them. And we can explain some of it, but not all of it. So clearly, we're working with a biological system that we have barely scratched the surface of. So I was thinking about going back into engineering because I didn't want to participate in just treating chronic diseases over and over again. And a friend of mine in medical school, who was in medical school at the time, said, Madhava, you should look at anesthesiology. It's a very interesting field. It's very quantitative. You're only taking care of one person at once, and you might like it. And without knowing anything about the field per se, I decided I was not going to throw away my medical education just yet. And I switched from internal medicine into anesthesiology. And that's what I've been doing ever since. So it turns out, Carol, that it's a very, very fun field. Sometimes I just wake up in the morning and I can't believe what I do for a living. I actually go to work and render people unconscious so that their bodies can be dissected and return them back to an awake and aware state. What's fascinating about this is that we don't know what the mechanism is of our anesthetic gases, things like ether. And ether was demonstrated here in my hometown of Boston back in 1846 for the first time in a public demonstration at the Massachusetts General Hospital in a auditorium that's called the Ether Dome, which is preserved right now. And what was fascinating about that was that a dentist named Morton anesthetized a young man, and a surgeon removed a small tumor from his neck while he was rendered unconscious from ether. And when he awoke, he was asked if he had any recollection of the event, and he didn't. He was asked if he has any sensation of pain. Did he feel anything? And he said he didn't. And when that happened, half the people in the room who were witness to this spectacular event started to cry. These were surgeons who had hardened themselves from a career of watching their patients who they were trying to help scream in agony as they tried to do the right thing. So this was a remarkable breakthrough. And why is it almost 180 years later, we don't know how ether works? And this is a question that once you start really probing, brings us to what I believe is the boundary between physics and metaphysics, between who we are and who we think we are. So that's that is sort of how the trajectory of my life has led me to what I'm doing now. And the fact of the matter is that we don't know, we haven't answered a basic question about my own field, my own expertise. And then this led to many other questions about the scientific orthodoxy. Do we really know what we're talking about? And anyway, these are the kinds of topics I address in my book.
It's a really interesting inquiry. We don't really know how it works. We also don't know, where do people go? Where does their consciousness go? And it's so interesting that you mentioned hubris, because I think I've got a little bit of a bias about the medical field, because I do think there's a lot of hubris in it. And I do think that there's a lot of, we know the truth, we know what's right, we know what's best for you. And the truth is there is so much unknown. And this is kind of like the spiritual journey. There's more unknown than known. And these questions like, what does it mean to be awake? And does awareness require a functioning body, or does it arise of its own? Do you have any closer answers to that?
I believe I do. And what's interesting here is, as you introduced this particular topic, you said, where does consciousness go? And right away, you are challenging the medical orthodoxy regarding this issue. Because implied in that statement is that consciousness is continuous. But that's not what my colleagues would say. We just say, well, you stop being conscious and consciousness goes away and you're unconscious. And that model seems to work most of the time. In fact, it doesn't have to be proven to be true to work, because that's how we view it as people who are not unconscious, who are not anesthetized, is this person is not reactive. But how do we know that consciousness does not continue? Well, the only way we think we know is that they can't remember what happened to them. So we say, oh, they were unconscious. That consciousness was interrupted, let's say. It was a stream of experiences that came to a halt temporarily and then was restarted. We also must say that maybe it was continuous, but they just can't recall what happened to them. How do you prove which one is true? And you can't. And this is why anesthesiology is so interesting, is that there's a lot of things here that, because we can't even identify the mechanism in which these gases work, we should, if we were actually rational and humble, be able to say, well, there's a lot of unknowns here, and maybe we should look a little bit closely. And it's not like we're not looking. The all anesthesiologists and anesthetists, when they first enter an operating room for the first time, and you're with an attending anesthesiologist for the first time, and you're trying to figure out, boy, what's going on back here behind the drapes and what's happening with the patient, almost always within the first day or two, the mentor is going to point at the vaporizer. These are highly calibrated machines that deliver a very specific concentration of anesthetic gases to the patient. And they say, Madhava, if you can figure out how that works, and that they're not talking about the vaporizer, but the gas, if you figure out how the gases work, you are going to win the Nobel Prize. And this is the same statement that's been made for decades and decades and decades, and no one has figured it out, and no one has won the Nobel Prize for this. So in order to answer the question, you have to approach this obliquely, which is, what else are we missing when we look at the realm of experiences in the operating room, for example? And the paradigm that we're trying to confirm, validate, or reject is, does your physiology, which is made up of molecules, is it giving rise to your awareness, or does awareness arise of its own, as you pointed out? Well, in order to understand this, you have to be able to explain everything that's observed. And we, with our paradigm, cannot explain a couple of very, very provocative examples of where the body doesn't seem to be giving rise to awareness. And here I'm talking about near-death experiences.
Right.
And it's one thing to have a near-death experience, out in nature, or, you fall into a swimming pool or something like that. It's another to have one in an operating room where you're being monitored more closely than you've ever been monitored before. And from our perspective, you're dead. Your heart has stopped. You don't have any brain activity or random brain activity. You don't have a blood pressure. You're not breathing. You have no signs of life. And we obviously, as physicians and medical care practitioners in that situation, are doing our very best to resuscitate you, to bring you back to life by giving you medications, giving you oxygen, taking over your breathing for you, hoping that your heart will start pumping again and your physiology will be restored. And sometimes we're successful and sometimes we're not. Sometimes a patient will, be revived and will later recount what was said and done. And these refer to times where we thought they were clinically dead. How are we to explain this? And we are very quick to say, well, that's just an exception to the rule. But there are many exceptions to the rule. This is not just one once in a lifetime of once in a generation. This happens. I don't want to say regularly or commonly, but it happens. We can say regularly, but not so commonly. But how do we explain that? We can't, not using our model. We can't explain why this person could recount everything that was said and done. And from their perspective, they said, well, the reason why I know these things is because I witnessed it from above. I saw my body and I saw what you were doing. And that's why I know what happened. So right away, for this person, his awareness was non-local. It was not localized to the body. How could the body then be giving rise to awareness, let's say? So this is just one wrinkle in the paradigm. And, the other wrinkle, which potentially can be researched even more closely and validated, is the evidence for reincarnation, which has a very, very interesting set of data that confirms that at least some people reincarnate, or potentially we all reincarnate, and most of us can't remember that we reincarnate. And I could, summarize that if you'd like me to right now.
Yeah, maybe a little bit, and then I want to get into your book. I do
Okay.
think that most people who listen to this podcast would be open to reincarnation, would be open to out of body experiences and near death experiences and all that. It is interesting hearing this from a medical professional and an engineer. Also, I also have a background in engineering, so I understand that.
Oh,
Yeah, I that's what I'm thinking about. I was really like, how did you give up all that electrical engineering? I kind of get it because I did too, but that's a hard degree. And mine's in chemical engineering. That's a hard degree. It's not easy. I call it an advanced degree, even when you just get a bachelor, because it's not an easy one to get.
yes, there are easier ways to get a bachelor's degree, that's for sure.
Right. So let's go into this a little bit, and then we'll
Well,
get into your book.
right. Well, the reason why this is important is another researcher who is a physician. His name was Ian Stevenson. He's one of several. He found something very amazing, and he spent his entire life documenting cases of reincarnation. And the cases or the people who were involved were not middle-aged men and women who claimed that they were Cleopatra or King Arthur in a past lifetime. These are children. From the first time they're able to express themselves, are recounting what they say are previous lives that are very mundane, but they have just an uncanny level of detail and specifics in how they recount their past life. What's interesting about Stevenson's work is that he or his colleagues have been able to find the families from which this young child says they used to live in, and the child is reunited, if you will, with this family, and the child can identify everybody in the family, identify the house that they lived in. And uh, they did a pretty good job of trying not to lead the subject to prove their hypothesis, and in fact, introduced imposters at the first meeting to see if the child who believes that they had lived with this family in a previous lifetime can identify the imposters as well as the people in their family, and they can. So, how do we explain this? How many cases are there like this? And the answer is thousands of them. So, the reason why this is interesting is once again, it pokes a hole in our paradigm that our physical body gives rise to our awareness or consciousness. And it also pokes the hole in a much more important assumption that we make, which is when we die, we're done. There's no more. Obviously in some schools of thought, people say go
Mm-hmm.
to an afterlife or a heaven. But here we're saying, well, it seems to me that we keep coming back. And what does this mean? Imagine if we keep coming back. How would we live our lives? What kinds of policy decisions would we make if we knew that what we're doing now, we were going to have to reap the benefits or suffer the consequences of what we do right now? Not, we can say, well, our children, we have to worry about our children and our grandchildren. No, it's going to be us, maybe 3 generations
Mm-hmm.
down after we die and we come back. Would we make different choices? What do we say about generational trauma of ethnic groups, let's say, who have been persecuted in the past? Who did the persecution? We identified, groups that's, well, the Nazis did this to the Jews and we did this to, African Americans. What if, the African Americans or Jews were let's say, the persecutors back then? We don't know. Here's the thing: is I'm not at
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
dismissing generational trauma. I'm saying, how do we know who's more culpable right now in terms of the souls that are living on this planet? We actually don't. If we were able to accept the fact that we don't know, and we may have been on the wrong side of history before, or we may have been the victims, the only logical thing, knowing that we don't know, is to stop tormenting each other today. Let's just
Uh,
stop. Let's
yeah.
do what, someone said a couple thousand years ago, whether or not you believe he lived or not, just forgive people right now. Why don't we just forgive? It's obviously the only solution to move forward is to forgive and then move on. Why do we keep going in the circle of hurting each other? So this is why these kinds of topics, especially when you can tie it to the physiology of the body and the enormous amount of evidence that this is what's happening. What if we all, given the fact that we can't know, we have to make assumptions? Which assumption is better? That this is all happening at random, we're just going to have to defend ourselves? Or why don't we run with the assumption that we're actually reincarnating? What's going to give us the better future? I mean, it should be pretty clear that, it's probably going to be better if we just assume we're reincarnating and stop hurting each other, right?
Right. Absolutely. I love this idea that we don't know. And I think that's one of the things I was so attracted to you and your book. And I didn't share with the audience early on. I found you because I'd read a Substack blog that you had written, and it was an article about attending a medical conference. And it was so refreshing to experience this highly intelligent person who I saw you as being willing to be in the question and not being so stuck in what we know and just this we don't know. There's so much more that we don't know than we do know. And if what you're saying, this idea of karma or reincarnation and forgiveness, you're absolutely right. Forgiveness would completely just dissolve this stuff that we're stuck in. We are stuck in these contrived divisions, and I think they're contrived. I think that let's keep fighting each other and let's keep seeing that other as an enemy, and we keep doing it over and over and over again. It's not just the wars on the other side of the country; it's here too. And the idea that if we just woke up and said, we just got to forgive everybody because my perpetrator could have been me in a past life or could be me
Mm-hmm.
in a future life, we're all kind of the same in a way. We're all kind of one. We're all playing these different parts. And wouldn't we create a better future for 7 generations? It was at the Native Americans that said 7 generations down there, down the way, if we just forgave. I'm really, really delighted that you brought in the idea of forgiveness. It's really underrated. It's not talked about a lot. And it breaks all those chains.
Right. Well, we talk about it once a week, right?
Maybe.
But we don't practice it. Yeah, maybe. I mean, that's the thing is like, you got to walk the walk as well. And it also this paradigm of we reincarnate and we don't know for sure. No one is saying you must believe that that's what's happening. But here's something interesting is that there's another stream of thought, like you brought up karma, for example, the idea that there's an opposite reaction, or there's you'll have to pay for your actions
Yeah. Cause and effect.
now. Cause and effect. Well, a lot of people prescribe to the idea that, yeah, maybe there's karma, but as long as I do these things, I will be saved. And, or choose someone as my savior, for example, without going into specifics. And the point here is, imagine that you are a person, a soul, and you're in this body, and you are absolutely certain that if you do these 10 things that are commanded, you are going to go to an everlasting heaven. And therefore, you do those things. Compare that with a person who doesn't know whether or not what their fate is going to be, but chooses to do it anyway.
Mm-hmm.
What is the difference between the vibration of these two people? There's a difference. One person says, well, it's a transactional thing. I'm just going to do all the right things so I get my, just reward. And the other person says, I don't know, but I'm going to give anyway. That's a very, very powerful statement about who they are, which is why I believe that's why we cherish the uncertainty. We acknowledge the fact that we don't know, and yet we act in whatever way we wish to act. And I feel that's more defining in terms of your trajectory.
I love that. The energy is definitely different, transactional versus just
Mm-hmm.
one. The other one kind of comes out of almost out of an innocence and out of just just a what if, just out of kindness, I think. Let's talk about certainty. Let's move into your book. In your book, you say certainty is, in fact, a product of a deluded mind. I love these very, very bold statements that you make. And because you just go on any social media platform and everybody's certain. I mean, everybody's certain
Mm-hmm.
about what they know to be the truth, what they know, their facts, they're this, and I'm certain it's this, and I'm certain it's that. And they don't have to say, I'm right, you're wrong. They're just certain. And there's no space in that. There's no space in the inquiry. And and I think that when we were talking back about the near death and consciousness and all, if they're true scientists who are seeing these or observing these things, your true science is about being in the inquiry, right? About seeing, observing something, and then asking the question, and then proving something else, versus being so certain that the narrative that I've learned in medical school, or the narrative I learned from the government, or the narrative I learned from my church, or whatever, is true. So let's talk about your book and how you kind of go through. You talk about certainty, and let's get into some of the biases that you so beautifully lay out for people. And I just wish that everybody could learn these biases that you talk about.
Well, that's a very thoughtful question that will take me a little bit of time to answer. So I want to be very clear here. When we say, certainty is the product of a deluded mind, I'm talking about certainty about what is, not about what isn't. There's a big difference between the two. And to defend that statement, I'll say this, which is science is the endless pursuit of establishing what is. Why is it endless? It's because we can't know everything. We're limited human beings. And if you want to know everything about something, you have to know everything about everything because everything is connected. We just as an example, you want to know everything about that tree over there? Well, you have to know about the soil, you have to know about the climate. You have to know about, what are the creatures that attack it? How does it defend itself? How does it communicate with others of its kind? So in order to know all of those things, you have to know everything about those things, and that goes on and on and on. So we're never going to be able to know what is. We should be able to agree that that's the case. And as you said, people everywhere are claiming that they know what is, and I don't. I do say I know what isn't, or at least being able to identify what is a mendacity. And the reason why I bring this up is the reason why I wrote the book was I was trying to get the reader to see the mendacity that is being given to us by people we trust. And by
Mm-hmm.
people I trust, I'm talking about institutionalized science and the government. But you just can't go there, is what I'm saying, right? People are like, well, you're a conspiracy theorist, or you're an anarchist, or you're anti-science. You just cannot go there if you actually want to have a meaningful discussion that can hopefully lead to a shift, even a gradual shift, because people are stuck in how they feel about things. So, as you said, I the first third of the book was to introduce the idea of bias. And you can go online and type in, what are the types of biases and all these kinds of, conceptual ideas, which are very interesting, come up. But that doesn't really help someone. You can like make a list of all of these biases, but how do you know if you're biased or not? And that's where I believe I've offered something different to the reader, which is to use storytelling to describe a situation that's playing out in a way that you think, and realize if you're reading it intently, you've sort of come to a conclusion about what the answer is, but then out of nowhere, the answer is actually different. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. And it's interesting that you point that out, because I've spoken about this book has been out for 4 years, and I've spoken to a lot of people about the book, and it's very heady, and I go into a lot of different things as we talked offline, like the monetary system, anesthesia, as we've just talked about. But everybody just wants to hear about the bias stuff. It's like, oh wow, that was brilliant how you brought up the biases, because it's a different way of talking about it. And as we as human beings, we don't learn from books. We learn a little bit, but the way we really, really make a difference in how we are changing the way we're perceiving the world is through stories. It's always been like that. And that's why I use that approach to talk about these, very, very dense and heady things, is you have to start with a story. And, you mentioned there's a chapter on the monetary system. It's very dry. Who wants to hear about, monetary supply and those kinds of theories? But if you tell it in a story, now it becomes more interesting, and it becomes very, very valuable.
I completely agree. I love that you did that. And I've got to go back and read the monetary story again, because it's something that both of these things are not taught in school. Our children do not go through school and learn about biases. They learn about confirmation bias, but I think you lay out like 11 of them, and there's all different biases. Some of my favorites are the unwillingness to look closer, the perceived legitimacy of the majority, the overconfidence in an adopted opinion. And you can see that happening all across the world today, that when the majority has opinion, that must be the right opinion. And we've seen how that has failed in the past, and it continues to fail. It could be true, but it may not be. The point I'm trying to make is that our children are not learning these things. Our young adults are not learning these things. I did not learn these things when I was in school. I didn't learn about all these biases and how I can critically think. And the money system. I don't know. I know very few people, I could probably count on one hand, who understands how the money system works. And yet it drives our personal lives. It drives things like our auto loans, our home loans, what we buy, the economy, and it drives war. So it's very, very important to understand what is underneath these things. We can say we're against war, but if we don't understand the monetary system, we don't even know how to go about changing it.
Yes, 100%. And look, for your viewers, I want to say this. I believe, I'm not certain, but my general view is that the vast majority of human beings on this planet are very, very good people. I'm not saying that everybody's good. I'm saying that like most people are. But notice how how we actually view the world. We think, well, all the Russians and Vladimir Putin are horrible, and depending on where you fall on the Gaza situation, one side is absolutely disgusting, and then we have billionaires who are terrible, terrible people, and we actually live in a world, or the world that we actually live in, which is the world that we're conceiving, has a lot of bad guys. And I'm suggesting that that's actually not the way it is, that we are being controlled many in a big part by the monetary system to drive us into this situation where we are in a competitive environment with everybody else. And I truly believe that we live in a world of abundance, but we are being indoctrinated to think that we're living in a world of scarcity. I believe that On this planet, we have ways to liberate humankind from our needs so that we can be a more contemplative species and not one that is constantly trying to survive. I believe that this is being done by design, and it takes curiosity and some courage to look deeply into this. And a good place to start would be the monetary system itself.
Well,
Carol.
there's a reason that they're not teaching it in school. I think you say also in your book that
Yes.
with different assumptions comes a different paradigm. So we are living in a set of assumptions, and we are giving up our own personal authority to external authorities. And the consequences of that is that we are living in the world that we're living in, which you
Mm-hmm.
mentioned is scarcity and it's fighting and this idea that it's human nature. It's the strongest survive and war is part of human nature and things like that. And I think what you're saying is that these are assumptions. This paradigm that we're in are assumptions that we make. We can make different assumptions, and we keep
Mm-hmm.
buying them. It's in our media, it's in the news, it's in our movies, it's in our everything that we consume, video games,
Mm-hmm.
whatnot. And I
Yep.
just had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Judy Carmen, and she talked about can we evolve to, she calls it Homo ahimsa. Can we evolve from
Mm-hmm.
Homo sapiens, a dominant species, to Homo ahimsa, which she believes is like
Beautiful.
our true nature? And why don't we believe that's our true nature? It's the assumptions we're making.
Well, Carol, I would say that it is your guest who brought up this term Homo ahimsa. We have to be careful here because when we bring up things like this, people think that we are being a little bit too idealistic. Like we know that all of these, like how there's always been warfare on this planet ever since we can remember. How can you possibly tell me that we're actually a peaceful species when you have all of these conflicts that have taken millions of lives? And what I'm trying to introduce into the collective is the idea that most of these conflicts were not started for the reasons that we have been told. And one series of events that happened 60 years ago, starting with the assassination of the 35th president of the United States, President Kennedy, led to an entire generation of warfare. And I know, there are a lot of people that don't believe the official story, but it really requires a lot of research to really dig into how deep the lies were behind the Warren Commission and how suspicious the American public was 2 or 3 days after his burial. Only 48% of the people believed that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman. And the American public did not have access to the most important evidence, which is the Zapruder film. That
Mm-hmm.
was only shown to the public 13 years later in 1976. And the Zapruder film, which led to the Oliver Stone movie in 1992 about JFK, that was another instigator of interest into the research of this seminal event as an assassination of a president in our generation. And what I'd like to say about that is why didn't the public buy it to begin with? Right? They didn't even see the film. There were so many things wrong with what happened that day, right? From the very first, like all we knew is that, well, the first shots were reported from the grassy knoll in front of the president, not coming from this book depository on the right as his motorcade entered Dealey Plaza. Why was Lee Harvey Oswald running from the scene in a panic after successfully assassinating the president of the United States? He did not have an escape plan. There was no getaway car.
Yeah.
Why didn't he just, if he just wanted to kill the president and turn himself in, why didn't he do that? Why was he running in a panic? Why then was this man, before he could testify, as we saw, he said, "Look, I'm just a patsy. I'm not this. I didn't do it. This is I'm the setup guy. I'm the fall guy for a massive conspiracy." Why was this man murdered in the basement of the Dallas jailhouse while in custody? Someone goes in there and kills him, and this person who kills him is Jack Ruby, and this guy has ties to the underworld, was a nightclub owner, an unsavory person who claims that he was so incensed that this man killed his hero, John F. Kennedy. I mean, the story was so thin to begin with, and then a week later, President Johnson brings together a commission called the Warren Commission There were 7 commissioners. And who is one of the commissioner but Allen Dulles? And Allen Dulles was John F. Kennedy's arch rival, his arch nemesis. He was the previous head of the CIA, who was responsible for, another historical event that people really need to look into was the Bay of Pigs. And he was forced to resign by Kennedy. And Kennedy is known as saying, I want to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the winds. The CIA was his enemy. And yet, this man who no longer is the director of the CIA, has no governmental role, becomes one of the commissioners of the Warren Commission. I mean, it just stunk of conflict of interest. And the American people back then could see it. Only less than half the people believed that he was the only one. And this polls that were done subsequently maintained that only about half the public actually believed the story. And half the people said that we've been lied to. But what recourse do we have as little citizens? We don't have any. And then they released the Zapruder film, which is, a 26-second long home movie that became the most famous home movie in the history of film. And it showed what happened that afternoon. And you can see the very first shot hitting President Kennedy must have gone through his throat. He holds his throat like this. That means the shot was fired from in front of him. And then as he moved towards the grassy knoll, let's say, the next shot hit the right side of his head. This completely debunks the CIA story that the guy who shot him was behind and above him. Who grabs the exit wound after being shot? They're saying that he was shot through the back of the neck, and he didn't do this, he did this. I mean, that's ridiculous. So only 1 out of 5 people in America believed that Oswald was involved or acted alone in 1976. And what's concerning to me is that number continues to grow. And, I wrote a very interesting piece recently on my Substack called The Dangerous Rise of Coincidence Theories, which is a pushback at all of the, I don't know where your audience sits about this, but I've been sort of incensed or at least amused by all of the articles that have come forward in the last 4 years about why is your family falling for conspiracy theories? What's wrong with their psychology? And so this is kind of a way to push back at it. And what's concerning to me is that people are starting to fall into line with the official story about JFK, mainly because people are not that interested. Most people on the planet today weren't alive when JFK was assassinated. But here's what's interesting, and thank you for letting me go on this topic for a minute. Just a year after Kennedy was shot, Lyndon Johnson ordered the first combat troops into Vietnam. And Vietnam was a hot topic when President Kennedy was assassinated. Now, why did we go into Vietnam? It's because one of our ships, the Maddox, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in the South China Sea in what's called the Gulf of Tonkin. It's called the Gulf of Tonkin episode. Everybody should go look into that. What's interesting about this is that years later, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, admitted that that never happened. The U.S. was never attacked. Yet that was the event that drove us into, a decade of bloody war in Vietnam, 14,000 miles away from us. A very unpopular war. It was an unwinnable war. And what I'm trying to introduce to you here is that maybe some of these wars are not what we think they are, but they are actually events that we call false flag events, which are designed to bring about the mobilization of our military industrial complex. And that, of course, requires money, which is why money is now related to this. How do we pay for this stuff? Well, you need to take a good look at, monetary supply and central banking. And these are things that I know our legislatures have no idea about how they work, and they ought to, but they don't. It's important to teach our kids, but it'd be even more valuable to teach our legislators.
Yeah, I get that. So the war machine is behind these false flags, or the banking's behind these false flags. And we don't have time, but just let our listeners know a good portion of your book covers 9/11 as a false flag, and there's a lot there for people to read, and that also started a war. And this has been going on this has been going on since at least World War One, probably before that. I mean, probably way before that, but certainly in
Mhm.
the history of my family, I have a grandfather who fought in World War One. All of these wars were are kind of contrived. And so then therefore what we're saying is we believe that we're warring people, we believe that we'll always be at war, and that is not necessarily a true assumption. And instead
That's
of
right.
listening to our gut, like you said with the Kennedy assassination, most people didn't believe it. You can see things with your eyes, you can hear things with your ears, but then you're given this narrative, and then you trust the authorities. We're so trained to trust our authorities that we will even override our senses. Like, I saw that, I heard that, but wait a minute,
Hmm.
the authority tells us this, and they must have my best interest in mind. And so, therefore, I believe it. And I think that's epidemic in our world, this giving up our power for authority.
Correct. 100%, Carol. And, it's easier to just trust rather than to be skeptical. And it's safer. And you
That's
don't lose
true.
many friends that way, So it's much easier just to go with the flow. So up the topic of 9/11 is an immense topic, and maybe we can address it, in another conversation. But I do want to say one thing about this, about 9/11, which is, and it ties into my book, which is this one. First of all, I don't actually talk about biases. I talk about sources of biases because it's like identifying, making a mind identify its own biases is impossible. It's like asking someone to see their blind spots.
Mm-hmm,
You
mm-hmm.
can't do it. You have to approach it obliquely. And so what I've tried to do here is identify situations that you're in or what you're doing that can give rise to bias. And one example is, am I looking at both sides with equal amounts of intention and research? Or am I only looking at my side? Or am I only looking at the side I disagree with? Are you doing that? Why is there an imbalance in inquiry? If there is an imbalance in inquiry, that doesn't mean you're biased, but it means that bias could arise. Like, you could come up with the wrong conclusion because you're treating it differently a priori. Now, what I want to say about that with regards to 9/11 is I've spoken to dozens and dozens of mechanical engineers and architects who disagree with me. Not one of them, not a single one, has actually read the 9/11 Commission report. More importantly, they have not read the technical documents or the technical explanation that was offered by the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST. They're the ones that said, oh, well, we know that the buildings fell from plane collisions and gravitational collapses. Did you read it? Or are you just going on what the New York Times said it said, or what Popular Mechanics said it said? You're free to do that. I'm not saying that, you must do it, but notice that you are trusting someone else.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You're fine to do that. I'm not saying that you should never trust anybody. I'm saying you can trust it. But notice that you're trusting and you're not being objective. You have to acknowledge that. If you're truly going to be a rational human being, admit that you're trusting someone else, and that is fine. No, I'm not telling people what to do. But if you're trusting someone, what right do you have to impose your belief system on somebody else and denigrate them for not going along with you? That's where ethics comes into this. And if you're an ethical person, you should say, well, yeah, I am, it's just my belief system. And there's no reason for me to force you to believe what I believe when I'm just trusting someone else. There's no reason
Yes.
why you should trust what I trust. So this is another way to sort of bring someone who's, relatively interested in getting to the truth, or more importantly, considers themselves to be, too smart to be fooled. Notice that that's what you're doing, and that is a way to come into this. And that's what led to the writing of my book. Was, I actually read all of those technical documents, and I have enough background to be able to call it out for what it is and what it isn't. And you'll be shocked if you actually read what NIST says in their technical explanation. They actually prove that Building 7, for example, blew up with their model, but they say that they didn't. They're flat out lying to you, 100% lying. Their model says that the building blew up, but they said that it fell from a gravitational collapse. And nobody is interested in questioning it because we're told that you shouldn't question it. And so here's where, you know, we find ourselves trusting in legacy media far more than we should.
Yeah, I remember during COVID, I either read the Pfizer study or I read what they published about their shot. And I remember very distinctly seeing that they were not making any claims that it was going to affect transmission or you're getting it. I remember that. I read that. But
Yep.
everyone around me was all over me. I got the shot. I'm not going to get it. And it's like, wait, where are you getting that? I read the what Pfizer put out, and that's not what they put out. And
That's right.
I lost lots of friends. and and I was the
Well, yeah.
crazy one. I was the crazy one. And it's played out
Wow.
to be that way. Yeah.
Well, Carol, good for you. Yeah, you're in the minority again, but I think people are coming to see this for what it is. But I want to be very clear here. I've been doing that for the last 4 years, and it is much harder to see the duplicity with regards to COVID than 9/11, because it is impossible really for the average person to go and read the trial studies
Right.
and pour through tons of data to replicate the calculations that were made. I mean, I've done that on some levels, and I publish my things on independent media platforms and for Children's Health Defense, who I've worked for a year during the pandemic. Going to what you said here, see, like that was an incredibly important observation you made, because you went and you looked at what Pfizer was actually saying, as opposed to, well, my doctor says that that's what happens. No, go look for yourself. I've spoken to many, many doctors about vaccine efficacy. So, you may remember that the efficacy of the Pfizer formulation was claimed to be 95%. And just as you alluded to, people said, oh, if I get the shot, there's a 95% chance I'm not going to get COVID, right? I mean, let's be real. That's what the public thought.
Yes.
That's also
Yeah.
what most of the doctors I talk to think efficacy means. And the reality is, it has nothing to do with that.
Mm-hmm.
It does not have to do with the chances of you getting COVID. It has to do with your relative risk of getting COVID compared to being unvaccinated. And the chances are, in just taking the Pfizer study as it stands, their data says that, well, there's a 20 times less chance you're going to get COVID if you got their vaccine over a very, very tiny time frame, 6 weeks on average. So, according to, like, I'm not saying that they're lying. I'm saying if you go with what they said, that is a very marginal benefit, because the chances that you were going to get COVID in that 6 weeks in the study is also extremely low. So, that is actually not the metric we as clinicians should be using when we're trying to assess the utility of a preventive measure. It is not the efficacy. The metric is, how many people do you need to vaccinate in order to prevent an outcome? That's what you have to do. And I would imagine that your intuition says that the number of people that you had to vaccinate to prevent, say, a hospitalization with COVID is very, very high, not low. You want it to be a very low number. It's like, oh, if I give 10 people the vaccine, I'll prevent one case of going to the hospital. That's not it at all. And I've never asked a physician who commonly advises their patients to get the vaccine. They've never been able to tell me what the number needed to vaccinate is to prevent serious COVID. Not one. And I look at them and say, what is this based on? Like, why are you telling your patients to get vaccinated if you can't tell me what the number needed to vaccinate is? And, for the audience, that number per the Pfizer trial is 2,500. This is a terrible, terrible preventive measure. And it has not necessarily with how bad the vaccine is, but how rare COVID is to begin with that puts you in the hospital. So it's a combination of both of things. We don't have to go into the mathematics, but why are doctors saying you need to get vaccinated? They can't even tell us what the number is. And so, this is again where the people who should know the most actually don't. They can't even define, give me the algebraic formula for vaccine efficacy. I've never met a physician who prescribes the vaccine that could tell me that very simple arithmetic formula. So this is the world we're living in. The people who should know actually don't. We're trusting. They're
Yes.
trusting.
Yeah, everybody's trusting. And ultimately, I want to pivot a little bit to intuition. You mentioned intuition. Because do you
Yeah.
believe that we have this power of intuition that really can, it really does inform us if we are able to I'm looking for words. I don't want to say block out all the rest of the world, but if we really trusted who we were, who we are as human beings, and if we really got to that place where we trusted our intuition, do you believe that we will make the right decisions for ourselves?
Well, I'm going to answer that, but I'm going to answer it by first asking you this. What if we didn't have that ability? Where would that lead us? Imagine the kind of predicament we would be in, right? And so, what we're really asking here is a very fundamental question about how you think reality works. If you really think that we don't have that ability, then we are at the mercy of whoever has the most money, whoever has the most power,
Right.
whoever has the most authority. So if you believe that that's the way it is, I'm sorry, I disagree with you because I believe in a merciful planet, in a merciful world, in a merciful universe. We must have that. If we didn't have it, we, you know, we would be at the whims of people that cannot be trusted. So I'll start there. So, to open your mind is like, let's at least hope that that's what exists. Now, the answer to your question is yes. I believe that if we can access our intuition, whether it exists or not, is the first question. But if it does exist, I believe it will lead us through. And I believe that we are, as a species, coming to grips with the fact that that's the way it has to work, because we cannot, especially trust the people who've been granted legitimacy around all of these narratives. We really shouldn't trust them. They are not to be trusted. And by that, I don't mean, if they say A, the answer must be B. I'm saying don't, just because they say A, don't think that it must be A. So the real question, the practical question here is, how do we access our intuition if it all exists? And this is why the book is about first identifying your biases. Once you can realize that you are making an assumption that's not based on objectivity, but on prejudices or prejudgments, which are biases, then if that's what you're doing, you don't have access to intuition in that situation. You have to clean yourself up. You've got to clean the whole thing up first and realize, like, wow, I made an assumption there and I probably shouldn't have. Why did I make that assumption? Once you can get rid of all of those things, and this requires a tremendous amount of self-reflection and work, then you have a chance at accessing, I believe, what I would call intuition or a self-knowing. And it is not cognitive. It comes to you, I think, in bodily sensations and or just an inner knowing, like, yeah, that has to be true. Like, just makes sense that that's the way it would be. And it's not easy to access in our world right now when we are completely, being swayed and pulled in different directions, where our attention is being pulled in different directions. How often do you sit and just feel what is coming up for you? And the other important thing I would like to add to that is there are a lot of so-called intuitives who say, oh yeah, I feel it right there. Right there, I feel it. I'm right. They have to be careful as well, because if they haven't cleaned up their head first, your head can generate a physical emotion. Like, think about fear. Oh my gosh, that makes my stomach. Oh, what if the fear is unfounded? Have you looked at that yet? Because maybe you're not believing what you're supposed to be believing. So you have to clean up the head before you can get to the heart. So that's what I'd say about that.
That's
Cursorily.
great. Yeah, I think that's great. So that's really what's up for us now, is cleaning up our head so that we can see our where we have these prejudgments and clean all that up.
Mm-hmm.
I think our intuition, our gut, has gotten us evolutionarily where we are. Probably
Mm-hmm.
over millions of years more than our head. We have a gut sense about danger. We have a gut sense about love or what's good coming towards us. I love that you say that you believe that we're in a merciful world, a merciful universe, and so therefore, we have this gift of intuition. We have this gift to navigate the world ourselves and not be imposed upon by powers that shouldn't be, that don't have our best interest in mind. And we need to wake up also
Mm-hmm.
to the fact that authorities don't always have our best interest in mind. And going back to something you said a while ago about balanced, are both sides being looked at? It's that's also kind of
Mm-hmm.
contrived in the reality where when you Google something, you don't get here are all the pros and here are all the cons, or here when in the COVID years, to me the logical thing would have been, let's gather all of the best doctors and let's talk about what they're seeing and let's talk about their experiences and let's talk about their treatments. They didn't do that. It was not like a let's gather all these different ideas. So I think just being
Yeah,
aware that we are not looking at both sides very often. And that's probably a good place to start to clean our heads up.
absolutely correct. And this leads to something very interesting. I would like to leave your audience with this before we go, which is first you have to be able to see that you're not being given the whole story by doing a Google search. And that right away is difficult for people to accept. The real challenge that we're being confronted with right now is to be able to answer the question, what do you do when experts disagree? The vast majority of us are not experts in our fields. Even in our own fields, we're not experts. How then are you supposed to negotiate a situation where two experts, people who both know more than you, don't agree on something, right? That's actually where we were at with COVID. We only heard one side. We didn't hear all of the thousands and thousands of highly credentialed physicians and scientists that were bucking the narrative, which is why censorship and Google searches are so dangerous. So if you're talking to a very thoughtful and objective person and ask them, what do you do when you have the two people who can't agree, two people who are experts that don't agree, and you don't know, how do you decide who's right? It's a very, very difficult question and a thoughtful question to ask. So what I like to do is to first say, look, do you realize that both sides are mirror images of each other? Let's take out the facts, because you don't know enough about the facts to know who's right, because it's beyond you. It's up here. You're down here. You don't know which facts are true or which argument is better. Both sides are saying that the other side is wrong. Both sides are saying that the other side is spreading dangerous misinformation. Both sides say that the other side is being incredibly gullible. What is the difference between the two sides? There's one massive difference. One side is pleading for a debate, and the other side is saying, "Whoa, we can't have that.
Ah, yes.
That's futile. It would be dangerous." All right. Now, that doesn't mean that that side is wrong, but you must ask yourself, if they were wrong, how would they know if they don't let a debate happen? You could be wrong for a very long time if you don't want to hear a dissenting opinion. So, what do you do? I'm not telling you that the dissenters are right, or that the orthodoxy is right. I'm just saying that's the predicament that you're in. If you truly want to be honest about what you believe, why are you doing it that way? You don't know. But you first have to know that they're experts. So that's why there's been this incredible attack on independent voices, because they know if there was a debate, they wouldn't be able to defend their position. They couldn't. That's why they won't have a debate, and they couch it in, well, that would be futile, and they're
It's
too stupid to
dangerous.
even argue with us. I mean,
Yeah.
really, that's the person you want to believe? Well, yeah. Okay, let's put. I know we're running down here. Let's say we have an expert that knows more than you, right? How would that person convince you that they're right? Would they say, please ask me any question you want, I'm happy to answer it? Or would they say, look, you don't know enough, so you really shouldn't be asking questions like that? And if you don't believe us, you're obviously stupid. Why would you believe someone like that? Because if they were smart, they would realize that you don't know as much as they do, so they have to bring some compassion to this. And they cannot force you to believe what they believe, right? I mean, now, if that makes sense to you, I suggest that you're using your intuition right now. Intuitively, that should make sense Do you see like how that feels? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. Okay, so that's a way to act, you have to know what it feels like. And, maybe that didn't resonate with you. I don't know, but it did for me. And that's why I believe intuition is real.
Thank you so much for that. I think that was really, really useful. And as we close, I just want to remind the audience that I believe this is a spiritual conversation. I believe that intuition, it's wisdom. It is our God-given gift. And whether you believe in God or the great mystery or source or whatever your name for it is, we are endowed with intuition. We are endowed with this wisdom and a deep knowing. And it's something that is really up for us now if we want to flourish and create a new world, a more compassionate world, a more creative world. That it really depends on this intuitive gift of ours to really be actualized, to be activated. And this is why I want to have this conversation, because you've given us a lot of good information about it and about how to listen to it. And those concluding comments are just really, really helpful. Just be aware of who wants to be open in the conversation, who wants to lead you and help you, and just recognize that you don't know, let me help you understand, versus who wants to shut out everything else and not even bring it up for debate. Very, 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 very useful. I appreciate it so much, Madhava.
Oh, well, you're welcome. And, as you said, I agree with you. This is a spiritual conversation, a spiritual topic. And my hope is to redirect these spiritual communities that are, they do a lot of esoteric work, the personal experience of who I am, and whether that be meditation or prayer, ritual. Um, if you can't marry it with something that's more exoteric, like what is happening in the world, what is happening to us as not just individuals, but as societies and groups, then, it's okay to keep doing what you're doing. But in order to be whole, we have to see both sides of this, the other side, like what is outside and what is inside. And that's what's missing right now in conversation, because we have, obviously, if you want to know what's going on outside, just go to CNN or, whomever. And if you
Yeah.
want to know what's going on inside, let's go on retreat and just, meditate with, mala beads or do your yoga. But who is bridging the gap? Who is bringing both together? Because you need both. You cannot be, I would say, completely actualized until you can bring your inner self, the intuitive spirit, to apprehend what is happening outside of you. And you must also be aware of the beauty, the power of the objective cognitive mind that you've been given in order to clear up your own biases so you can access your intuition. This is a very, very spiritual practice. And that's why this conversation is so important. And thank you very much for what you're doing as well, Reverend.
Well, I'm going to have you back on if you're willing, because I think we can go on for another 2 or 3 hours. So thank you so much for being with us. I really appreciate your time. Appreciate your book. I appreciate your clear mind and your questioning mind and your intuitive heart. I think you're bringing great, great, great stuff to the world, and I'm so grateful for you. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you for giving me a voice on your platform and asking great questions. If I may, for your audience, I write a Substack blog, if you will, and it's called An Insult to Intuition, where I try to bring up these ideas so that you can, chat, like, is your intuition agreeing with what you're being told? So that's really the nature of what I'm trying to bring to the world right now. But I really love these conversations. Thank you for having me, Carol.
So, so, so important. Thank you, everyone who's joined us today. And I now close the Spiritual Forum.